The wind arrived before the sound. In the desert of Uz, it does not come as relief. It comes as pressure, as erasure. 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen. Gone. A man who built everything with his own hands, sitting in ash, scraping his own skin with a shard of broken clay. This is not metaphor. This is the record. Then they came. Eliphaz with theology that smothers. Bildad with logic like a knife. Bloodless. Wrong. Zophar with verdict instead of mercy. They tore their robes. They threw dust into the air. 7 days of silence. And then they opened their mouths. You suffer because you sinned. You sinned because you suffer. The moral universe is mechanical, predictable. And Job, in their telling, had simply broken one of its gears. But Job was not broken. Job was burning. And what burns that long, that completely, is not guilt. It is something far more dangerous. It is a man demanding that God answer him face to face. The oldest question in human history is not, does God exist? It is, does God see? Watch now. The wind arrived before the sound. It always comes this way in the desert of Uz, not as a breeze, not as relief, but as pressure against your face before tearing away anything not nailed to the ground. The sand does not fall. It flies horizontal. Job's tent poles had already disappeared. The stones of the corral walls, built by hands he himself had supervised, scattered like bones in a battle no one saw happen. And he was sitting there, in the ash, fingers buried in parched earth, scraping his own skin with a shard of broken clay, while the smell of smoke still permeated every fiber of the cloth covering what remained of his body. This is not metaphor. This is the record. Job existed in a region that researchers identify with Transjordan or the northern Arabian Peninsula, an area of camel herders and cattle ranchers, of a prosperity the texts describe with an almost accounting-like precision. 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen. That man was not a symbolic figure at the beginning of the story. He was a landowner, a patriarch. And the earth beneath his knees, when it was all over, was warm with the memory of what it had been. The friends arrived afterward. Eliphaz came first, with theology like a warm blanket that smothers. His voice carried the practiced gentleness of someone who believes that kindness and correction are the same thing, that offering a framework for your suffering is a form of love. He was wrong. Bildad came with logic like a knife, accurate, bloodless, and wrong in a different direction entirely. He had memorized the rules of the moral universe and arrived prepared to cite them. The rules said Job had sinned. The rules were not interested in Job's face. Zophar came like a man who had never suffered a single day and was quietly furious that Job refused to behave accordingly. He did not offer warmth. He offered verdict. The Hebrew reveals that the three of them tore their robes when they first saw Job. The verb is kara, and the sound of the word is almost onomatopoeic, a dry tear in the fabric of silence. They threw dust into the air. They sat in silence for 7 days and 7 nights. This was not generic consolation protocol. It was a mourning ritual of specific weight within the culture of the ancient Near East, where silence was more eloquent than any speech, where their physical presence represented a kind of bodily solidarity that words did not yet have vocabulary to express. The problem was that after 7 days, they opened their mouths, and their words were theology. Ordered, systematic, safe. The theology of retribution. You suffer because you sinned. You sinned because you suffer. The moral universe is mechanical, predictable, just in the way mechanical justice works. And Job, in their telling, had simply broken one of its gears.
Job responded to all of them with an honesty that scandalized. Not because he blasphemed, but because he did not perform. He did not pretend to be fine. He did not construct a facade of piety to impress the divine audience. He said what he felt. And what he felt was that the God he loved seemed to have become the God who was destroying him. Stay with that for a moment. The central paradox of the book of Job is not suffering. Human suffering is documented on every page of every civilization that has ever existed. The paradox is faithfulness within suffering. It is the man who still speaks to God after God, in his perception, had abandoned him. It is the conversation that continues when there is no emotional reason for it to continue. And it is in that conversation, long, exhausting, philosophically dense, that the moment arrives that changes everything. The moment when the voice responds. And the voice does not respond with explanations. The voice responds with a whirlwind. If you have not yet stopped to think about what it means for God to choose a whirlwind to speak, this is the moment to stop. The text in Job chapter 38 verse 1 says that the Eternal spoke to Job from the midst of the storm. The word the Hebrew reveals there is seirah, which literally means storm, hurricane, whirlwind. But the etymology goes deeper. The verbal root of seirah is connected to the concept of hair standing on end, of skin that reacts to the imperceptible, of a shiver that passes through the body not from pain, but from sacred terror. The word carries within itself the physical memory of an encounter with something that is outside the scale of what the human mind can process. This is not poetic decoration. This is archaeology of language. There is a second use of the same root in Habakkuk, where the prophet describes the glory of God marching from the desert, and the same sensation of skin that reacts before the mind understands is present. The whirlwind was not chosen because it was a dramatic special effect. It was chosen because it was the most precise physical language to describe the encounter with the sacred that surpasses comprehension. An encounter that the body registers before theology can articulate. And here is the connection that 99% of readers pass right by. Job's friends had spoken about God. They had built arguments about God. They had systematized God within categories that would fit on a scroll that could be memorized, repeated, taught. Their theology was organized, logical, cold as polished stone. And it was wrong. Not wrong in the data, but wrong in temperature, wrong in scale. Wrong because it treated the infinite as if it were an equation that once solved would fit in the palm of the hand. Job never did that. Job screamed. Job demanded. Job said things that make the most conservative biblical commentators blink nervously. Where is the way to the dwelling of light is not a catechism question. It is the question of a man who is genuinely lost and who refuses to pretend he knows the way. And it is precisely that brutal honesty, that refusal to substitute the real encounter with a theological representation of the encounter, that prepares Job for what is about to happen.
The book of Job is not written like a sermon. It is written like a storm. It begins and ends in prose, calm, ordered, terrifying in its orderliness. And in the center, like the eye of a hurricane, where everything goes deadly still, before God opens his mouth, there is silence. The silence before the voice. Not the silence of resolution, the silence of suspension. A world holding its breath. The beginning and the end of the book reflect each other, the way two walls of a canyon reflect sound. And in the exact center of that canyon is the one moment of absolute stillness before the voice tears everything open. You feel it before you understand it. And what the text places at that center, in that stillness, is not an answer. It is the silence just before God speaks. Which means the entire architecture of the book is a frame for a single moment. The moment the whirlwind arrives. The Hebrew records this with a precision that translation nearly completely erases. When God finally speaks from inside the Seirah, the grammatical structure of the text does not use a common verb of communication. The root used for respond here is anah, which carries within it the idea of a response that is simultaneously testimony and appearance. It is not merely speaking. It is appearing as a witness in a judicial proceeding. Job had built a case, chapter after chapter, with an argumentative consistency that medieval rabbinic commentators compared to the great advocates of the royal court. Job had presented his defense, and now the tribunal forms. But the judge arrives in the form of a storm.
And the first word God directs to Job is not an answer to Job's questions. It is a question. Where were you when I founded the earth? The interrogative construction in the original, Aife hayita beyasti aretz, is not rhetorical in the sense of closing the conversation. It is rhetorical in the sense of expanding it, of forcing Job's mind to move to a scale where his questions, without being answered, are transformed into something different from what they were when he asked them. The civilization around Job was saturated with competing cosmologies. Egypt had its own. Mesopotamia had its own, codified in the Enuma Elish, where creation was the result of a battle between divinities. Marduk defeating Tiamat, chaos subdued by force. In all these cosmologies, the storm was the territory of the warrior divinity. Baal, the Canaanite storm god, was represented with lightning bolts in his hands. Thunder was his voice. Rain was his blessing, and also his threat. And the author of the book of Job chose precisely that image, not by accident, but by theological precision. By placing the voice of the God of Israel inside the Seirah, inside the whirlwind, the text is making a claim that is quietly subversive and violently specific. The same phenomenon that other cultures associated with lesser, capricious divinities is here the meeting point with the God who created the phenomenon itself. The storm is not a rival God. The storm is the audience chamber. And Job was summoned.
There is an archaeological detail that rarely appears in Sunday sermons about Job. Excavations in the Haran region of southern Syria and at Transjordan sites identified with the possible territory of Uz have revealed storm protection amulets dating from the 2nd millennium before Christ, exactly the period many researchers associate with the historical context of the book. The local population feared the storm, with a fear that had a name, a form, a ritual. There were procedures to appease the storm god. There were specific sacrifices. Job did none of them. Job simply waited.
And in the waiting, which lasted entire chapters of argumentation, of contestation, of despair articulated with a poetic precision that rivals any text of antiquity, something was being forged. Not resignation, not the quiet acceptance of the model sufferer that preachers sometimes fabricate. What was being forged was the capacity to sustain the tension, to live inside the question without resolving it with a cheap answer. And then the whirlwind arrived. He did not come in the whirlwind to win an argument. He came to shatter the scale on which Job had been measuring him. That is the claim the text has been building toward from the first line of chapter 38. And it lands not like a theological proposition, but like the wind itself. Before you understand it, you have already felt it. The God of Israel is not Baal. He does not arrive in the storm to terrify you into submission with a display of superior force. He arrives in the storm to show you something. Something so vast, so precisely ordered, so achingly articulate in its complexity. The gates of death, the treasuries of snow, the ordinances of heaven, the Pleiades bound in their courses. That your question does not disappear. It transforms.
Job did not get his answer. What Job got was something that made the question feel different. And that is the only honest theology that has ever survived contact with actual suffering. The friends had all the answers. The friends were wrong. Job had only questions and the refusal to pretend otherwise. And Job was the one God called righteous. Think about what that means for a moment. Not for doctrine, for your life. Job stood up from that ash not because he had answers. He stood up because he had encountered something that made the ash irrelevant. Not explained. Irrelevant. There is a difference between a wound that is healed and a wound that is swallowed by something so much larger than itself that it stops being the whole story. Job's wound was not healed in chapter 38. It was swallowed by the whirlwind. And Job stood up. The next video will show you the one line in Job 42 that most preachers skip entirely, and it is the most disturbing verse in the book. Not disturbing because it is dark, disturbing because of what it implies about God, about prayer, and about every tidy theology that has ever been used to explain someone else's suffering. You need to see it. Subscribe so you are there when it drops, because that verse will change the way you read everything else. The Hebrew uses the particle "ifa," which does not simply ask where in a geographical sense, but at what point of existence would you have been? A question about ontology, a question about the nature of the being who is asking. God is not silencing Job. God is relocating Job within the scale of the universe. And here is the connection that 99% of Sunday readings miss completely. The Seirah, the whirlwind, is not the backdrop of God's response. The Seirah is God's response. Think about this carefully. God could have responded in silence, could have appeared as light, as the pillar of fire that guided Israel in the desert, could have sent an angel with a written message, as he did on other occasions. But he chose the whirlwind. And throughout the entire ancient Near East, the whirlwind, that specific phenomenon of rotational wind that rises from the earth in column form, carrying dust and straw and fragments of soil, was the most visceral image of radical disorder. It was chaos in motion. It was what happened when structures failed. Job was at the center of a life that had collapsed into radical disorder, and God chose exactly that phenomenon as the vehicle of presence. Not to say that chaos is good,
but to say that chaos is not outside divine jurisdiction. The Se'ara, the vortex, is being inhabited by the same Ruach that in the second verse of Genesis hovered over the primordial waters of the Tehom, the formless abyss. The same presence that transformed the Tohu Vafohu, the void and the nothing, into structured creation is now speaking from inside Job's storm. The chaos of Genesis 1 was not destroyed, it was ordered from within. And the chaos of Job 38 is not being cancelled by a God who arrives from outside with ready-made answers. It is being inhabited. It is being spoken from within. The theology of the Se'ara is a theology of presence incarnate in discomfort. And this resonates far beyond the book of Job.
The book of Job is not written like a sermon. It is written like a storm. It begins and ends in prose, calm, ordered, terrifying in its precision. And in the center, like the eye of a hurricane where everything goes deadly still before God opens his mouth, there is silence. The silence before the voice. You feel it before you understand it. The beginning and the end reflect each other like a mirror held up in a hurricane. And what stands at the very center, the pivot, the place where everything folds back on itself, is not an abstract theological declaration. It is the image of a creature. Job 39 places at the center of the divine questions the figure of the raven, the wild horse, the eagle that makes its nest in the clefts of the rocks. And this is profoundly intentional. The structure is saying that at the heart of God's response to human pain is the non-human world. The world that exists without needing justification. The world that does not ask why, but simply is, simply inhabits, simply flies. Job had made the question why the gravitational center of his existence for entire chapters, and God does not answer the why. God shows the what, the immensity of what exists without reference to Job's suffering, not as cruelty, as expansion. Healing sometimes begins when the center of the universe shifts slightly away from ourselves, and we perceive that there is more cosmos than our pain can contain. This movement has a parallel that is verifiable. Research in affective neuroscience, especially the work of Dacher Keltner at the University of California at Berkeley on the emotion of wonder, what he calls awe, demonstrates that when a human being is exposed to something that genuinely surpasses their capacity for immediate assimilation, there occurs a measurable reduction in activity in the brain's default mode network. That network is exactly the one associated with rumination, with repetitive ego-centered thinking, with the uninterrupted narrative the self tells about itself. Awe interrupts rumination. And God, speaking from inside the Se'ara, is producing exactly that effect in Job. It is not manipulation. It is medicine. It is the oldest medicine that exists, being placed before something so much greater that the question about oneself loses for a moment its obsessive urgency. And then Job responds. Job 40, verse 4. And the word he uses to describe his own condition is keloti. I am insignificant. I am light. I am of little weight. The root is kalal, which means to be light in the sense of not having enough substance to weigh on the scale. But here is the inversion the text is executing in silence. Kalal is also the verb used to curse, to diminish, to depreciate. Job had accused God of making him little. He had felt depreciated by an indifferent universe. And now, before the Se'ara, before the question about the foundations of the earth and the chains of the Pleiades and the movement of Orion, now he himself acknowledges the kalal within himself.
but he acknowledges it as truth, not as accusation. There is an abyssal difference between being shamed and recognizing one's own scale with dignity.
This connects directly to the honor and shame culture of the ancient Near East. In an honor system like that one, the public admission of smallness was the worst of social fates. It was symbolic death. Eliphaz came with theology like a warm blanket that smothers. He arrived with a voice like warmed oil, smooth, helpful, and suffocating. And his argument was that Job must have sinned in secret, because God rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked, and the math of the universe simply does not lie. Bildad came with logic like a knife, accurate, bloodless, wrong. He had memorized every rule and forgotten every face, and he spoke to Job the way a judge speaks to a defendant who has already been found guilty before the trial began. Zophar came like a man who had never suffered a single day and was furious that Job refused to behave accordingly. A verdict delivered with the confidence of someone who has never needed the mercy he so easily withheld. These three were operating within exactly the honor system when they tried to explain Job's suffering as the consequence of hidden sin. Because in an honor system, visible disgrace means a visible moral cause. The logic was social before it was theological. Job, in saying koloti, is not being defeated by the friend's shame system. He is exiting the system entirely. He is acknowledging his scale before the Creator without that being a social defeat. It is an exit from above, an exit the Sayara made possible. If you are hearing this now, and there exists within you a question that has not been answered, a chapter of your life that continued without satisfactory resolution, the book of Job will not give you the answer you want. No biblical text will. But what the Sayara reveals is that the absence of answer is not the absence of presence. That God may be closest precisely in the whirlwind systems, in the moments when everything spins and you cannot fix the horizon. Not because pain is good, but because presence does not need ideal meteorological conditions to be real. This is what the Greek reveals when John writes in the prologue of his gospel that the Logos, the Word, was in the beginning with God, and that through him all things were made, and without him nothing that was made was made. The same Logos that structures the cosmos in the opening of John 1 is the Logos that entered the chaos of human flesh, that became basar, flesh, vulnerable matter, and pitched his tent among us. The Greek verb used for dwelt among us is eskenosin, which comes from scape, tent, tabernacle. The Logos did not come to a palace. He came to a tent, to the temporary structure, to the place the wind can tear down. The Sayara of Job and the eskenosin of John are making the same theological claim from opposite directions. Job discovers that God inhabits the whirlwind. John proclaims that the Logos inhabits the fragile tent of flesh. In both cases, the divine presence does not wait for stability. The divine presence is exactly that which installs itself where no permanent architecture exists. In the storm, in the flesh, in the whirlwind, in radical vulnerability. Jesus Christ, who is the Logos made flesh, who is the Son of David, who also recited the storm psalms, who slept in the boat during the tempest on the Sea of Galilee while the disciples panicked. Jesus did not calm the storm to show that God is above storms. He calmed the storm to show that God is inside the storm with authority over it. When he says, "Peace, be still," to the wind and the sea, the verb the Greek reveals is siopa, be silent.
which is the same verb used to silence a witness in a tribunal. He is not conversing with meteorology. He is closing a judicial proceeding that the cosmos had opened. As Job was summoned by the Seirah to appear before the cosmic tribunal, the disciples were being summoned by the same phenomenon to confront the fundamental question: who is this? And the answer does not come in words. It comes in the silence that settles after the storm stops. Job did not receive an explanation. He received a presence. And at the end of the book, when restoration comes, and it does come, the text does not hide it, it does not come because the questions were answered. It comes after Job prayed for his friends, after the man who had been at the center of his own suffering turned outward and interceded for others. There is a pedagogy of the Seirah that is only completed when the whirlwind passes and the person who survived it discovers that they have something to give. Not answers, presence. The same presence that inhabited them in the whirlwind. And this is where the subversive claim finally lands, the one the text has been building toward since Job opened his mouth on the ash heap. The God of Israel is not Baal.
Baal came in the storm to terrorize, to demonstrate dominance, to remind the creature how small it was by displaying how vast the power above it happened to be. The storm, in Baal theology, was a weapon of hierarchy. And every ancient person in Job's world would have heard the Seirah begin and assumed exactly that framework was being activated. God arriving, creature trembling, hierarchy reasserted, case closed. But that is not what happens. God does not arrive in the Seirah to win an argument. He arrives in the Seirah to shatter the scale on which Job had been measuring him. The questions God asks are not a cross-examination designed to humiliate. They are an invitation to stand at the edge of something so immense, so precise, so achingly ordered, and simultaneously wild, that the question Job had been screaming stops being the only question in existence. It does not disappear. It transforms. Job does not walk away with an answer. Job walks away with a universe. And the universe is larger than the answer would have been. This is the only honest theology that has ever survived suffering. Not the theology that explains why the ash heap happened, but the theology that is large enough to sit in the ash heap without flinching, and then stand up from it without pretending the ash was not real. Job stood up from that ash not because he had answers. He stood up because he had encountered something that made the ash irrelevant. Not erased, not explained. Irrelevant in the specific way that a single candle becomes irrelevant when someone opens the curtains and lets in the morning. The candle was real. The darkness it fought was real. But something larger arrived, and the scale changed. He did not leave the ash heap with a doctrine. He left with a scar and a direction. He left knowing that the voice that spoke from the whirlwind was real, not because the whirlwind answered his questions, but because the whirlwind knew his name. That is the testimony. Not that God fixes everything, not that faith protects you from the storm, but that the storm is not the last word on what God is willing to inhabit. He came to a tent. He spoke from a vortex. He slept in a boat that was filling with water. The pattern is consistent, and it is unmistakable. The divine presence has never required stable conditions. It has only
ever required that you be present enough to hear when the voice cuts through the noise. Job was. And at the end, after the whirlwind, after the silence, after Kalati, after the man who had screamed at the sky finally stopped screaming long enough to listen, he prayed for the very friends who had made his suffering worse. That is not a detail. That is the point. The whirlwind did not produce a man with better theology. It produced a man with a larger heart. The next video will show you the one line in Job 42 that most preachers skip entirely, and it is the most disturbing verse in the book. Not disturbing because it is dark, disturbing because of what it implies about God, about prayer, and about every tidy theology that has ever been used to explain someone else's suffering. You need to see it. Subscribe so you are there when it drops, because that verse will change the way you read everything else.